Hi, everyone. Pastor Dave here. I'm here to talk about wickedness, evil, because it should be clear to anyone that really reads the Bible or tries to understand what the purpose of evil is. And they're going to run into some serious problems. First of all, the notion that God did not create evil, and yet the devil created evil, is already a problem, because God created everything, God knows everything, God is all good. So how could possibly the devil create evil? He didn't. He was hired by God, and his interview for the job was the book of Job, where he had to beat Job up to challenge his faith, or Job's faith in God. So God created that scenario. So the devil, Satan, could prove to God that, that Job doesn't have any real faith, that his faith was really just, coerced, which I happen to agree. That is exactly what it is. But anyway, the conditions for this particular interview were created by God. So he created the circumstance to test Satan's resolve, it being evil, and God was satisfied that Satan would be a good patsy for being blamed for everything. So Satan is the symbol of evilness. Whether you think he's an actual creature or being or not is irrelevant, because in your own mind, if God is the creator of everything, then God created the devil. Lucifer becomes Satan through his act of evil, which God created. So you can't get away from the reality that God created wickedness. You cannot get away from that. I'm sorry. You can relabel it, call it the devil, but it doesn't do you or serve you any good whatsoever. And then, of course, the defense is, why did God do that? Why would he split the notion of God's creation into two distinct groups? One, God as goodness, and two, devil as evilness. And so these two different choices or options are supposed to be present so that a person can have free will. They can choose the path of goodness and to God, or they can choose the path of evilness or wickedness and Satan. And so that's the argument, or that's the defense of why there's wickedness, because God had to create this duality so that a person could have free will. So understand that the choice is, if you don't pick God, like if you don't pick the path of goodness and God, and you choose wickedness and Satan, you will be condemned. You'll go to hell. You'll be punished for eternity. You'll do whatever horrible thing that you can imagine. So God set up this scenario where you supposedly have a choice, but there is no choice. because that's not a choice. You're scared to death. You are forced into the only path that is possible, and that is goodness and God. Because if you don't, you will be punished severely. So I know that that seems logical to the believers, except that it's a trick question, because one, God created this scenario. So he created the elements of wickedness and then made it so impossible for you to choose wickedness, because if you did, you would be punished severely forever. So if those were truly the choices, then nobody would ever choose wickedness, which is why it strains believability, which is why it becomes absurd. Why is it that if God created all of this just so we would be forced into picking the one path to avoid the trappings of wickedness, for fear that we will be eternally punished? And then, of course, God is off the hook because he's made it so that the devil is the culprit, is the guilty party, is the real symbol of evil. And yet you do believe that God created everything. So it should strain your credulity here and say, well, then therefore God created evil. And you wonder, and he only created evil so that you would be forced into devoting yourself to God, which undermines the whole free will argument. So I don't get it. I don't understand belief. I don't understand your relationship between good and evil when God created it so that the only choice you could possibly make would be to pick God. But why would you pick God? Because it's really the same thing, since God created the evil in the first place. So that's why one should question the validity of this whole religious thinking. And it is the foundational thinking of the Judaism, of Christianity, and of Islam. Judaism, sorry. I know some people, Judaism, that's not it. I'm sorry, I'm American, what do you want? Judaism. So that's what we're left with. Three huge religions that have governed our history for a little over 2,000 years, and it's created quite a lot of havoc as a result of this one sort of trick to the basis of their religious thinking. And I know there have been so many minds that have, who have the intellectual ability to try to justify this scenario. But it really just comes down to it. God is both creator of good and evil, and he only made it so that you would pick good. But why bother picking evil, or why even create evil why didn't you just encourage everyone to be good? So it's just disturbing enough to know that this probably doesn't have a lot of legitimacy or a lot of validity. Obviously not legitimacy. Because it's not valid, because the whole argument is illogical. It just doesn't hold up. What kind of God would create a split world, a duality, where if you choose, okay, you have one path, you either choose the path where you don't put your hand on the hot fire, or you do put your hand on the hot fire. Now the choice is yours. You can stick your hand in the fire, or you can not stick your hand in the fire. So this not sticking your hand in fire will produce pleasure, no problem there, and sticking your hand in the fire will produce intense pain. So which one do you want? Who would pick hand in the fire? And then why even have that scenario? Why even give that choice? It's not a choice. It's nonsense. The hand in the fire is not a choice we would make, because we would be stupid to make that choice, because we would be in a lot of pain over it. So if that's the choice, eternal damnation and burning in hell, or the goodness of God, that's not free will. That's just not free will. That's not a thing. By your own construction, or by the construct of the Old Testament and the stories that they tell us, which you insist are literal, and this actually happened, you've got to admit that your God, your Old Testament God, is a nasty, cruel freak who likes to torture people. I mean, that just seems to be what's going on here. So any of the pain and suffering we endure is all the result of people choosing the evilness of demonic thinking, or choosing the devil. No, that's not what's happening. And that's not a useful construct of your own belief system. Because if you try to defend that, it's clearly just illogical. And it just is absurd to think that that's a real choice. But I know you're a believer, so your faith says, okay, that's what God said, then that must be what happened. And that's why you run into the trouble of literalness. If you insist that the Bible is literal and that these aren't just stories to get you to think about things like goodness and evil, well, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble, which means you're going to be anchored into this bad thinking right from the start, and you won't be spending any of your proper thinking about just these ideas in an allegory sense, or in a metaphorical way. This isn't useful for you to think of this as what literally happened. That God created the heavens and the earth, and then he created all of the angels, and then he created Adam and Eve and all of humanity to follow. And of course, he created this scenario, this idea of evilness. And of course, the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, is supposed to be the story that clearly illustrates good and evil, or the idea of free will. That, here was a rule, you're not supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge, but you can do anything else in the garden. So God set this little scenario up. And of course, he knew what was going to happen because he knows everything. So it's like, well, okay, first of all, that's another question about fate and destiny and free will. If God already knows what you're going to do, how much free will is that? But that's not really what my point is. My point is that he said to Adam and Eve, if you eat from the tree of knowledge, you will surely die. Now, they've only been on earth like a day, according to the Bible. Somehow they managed to become fully grown, we'll say maybe teenagers. I guess not fully grown. We can't be sure exactly how old they were, if they were 6 years old. But the suggestion is that they were, if some believers insist that they had sex. So then they would be at least pubescent teenagers, all in one day, of course, because you have to take it literally. So God created Adam as a young teenage boy. And then he got to get Eve a few hours later, gave him a nap. He wakes up, he's got this beautiful young teenage woman with him. Now, they don't know anything. God, Adam had spent some of his first day naming animals and doing stuff. So it was probably pretty busy for him. That was great. And then he gets his beautiful companion. And then the devil, here it is, the evil choice, shows up in the Garden of Eden. And, well, surprise, surprise, he makes a proposition to Eve. Eve, who is hours old, not very old at all, not even a day old, yet still had capacity to think and, I suppose communicate. But right now she was just experiencing the glories of the garden and, having fun with her young male friend. So what happens? The devil says, hey, you should eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. And Eve apparently didn't get it. And the reason why she didn't get it is because God told you that you would surely die. Now, there was never any discussion that death meant anything. So these young people who are only one day old never had this understanding of death. Like none of the animals died, or there was nothing in their life where they experienced death. So that when God said, you will surely die, the concept of death doesn't even make sense. So Eve goes, the devil was there. I mean, what kind of parent, first of all, would tell or would let, because remember, God knows everything. What kind of parent would leave his 2 one-day-old children in a garden and commit or allow this devil creature, this serpent, to live or exist in the Garden of Eden to torment what kind of, would you do that as a mother, as a father? Would you let your children go into the garden, the background essentially, or the backyard, and play without supervision, knowing that an evil being was going to be there to tempt your children? So they don't have they're only one day old. They don't have any knowledge about death. They're just one day old. Nothing has died. They don't understand anything. Their dog Fifi didn't die. Nothing died. Nothing died. They have no knowledge of death. So when God says you will surely die, they can't possibly know what that means. So the devil says, you're not going to die. And you go, okay. So she eats the apple and then encourages Adam to eat the apple. And there you go. Well, they didn't die, but God was so incensed, since he knew everything. Oh, my children did not choose goodness. They chose the path of evil. They didn't know. They knew what it was, what death was, what disobedience was. They didn't get it. One day old, you put them through this scenario, you deliberately set them up with an evil presence in your own backyard, the backyard you created to be perfect. It makes no sense. But that's the story that we're hanging our free will argument on. And I don't get that at all. So these children had to be evicted. And especially the idea that it's just, I know it's a metaphorical apple or a piece of fruit, but I could see the scenario like this happening everywhere around the world. I probably did it myself. where, my mom would say, don't go into Mr. Edwards' backyard and eat from his apple tree, or you're going to get in trouble. Now, we probably knew what that trouble might be. But even if we did, we got caught, and sure, Mr. Edwards drags us back in front of our mother and says, these kids were in my backyard and they ate my apple. I'm sorry, Mr. Edwards, I will take care of them. So you're the good parent, and you decide, okay, kids, because you went into Mr. Edwards' backyard and took one of his apples, you are going to go to your room without supper? Is that what you did? Are you going to, no TV, no internet, no phone for a week? Did that happen? No. What God said was, kids, pack up your things. Here, I'll give you a couple of animal fur skins and get the hell out of my house. So that's what you, as the parent, even though they did break your rule, and yes, they probably are deserving of punishment, is really evicting your children out of your house the right level of punishment, if we're to take things literally. After all, Eve ate a piece of fruit. She didn't have sex with the serpent. That's not what it says. It says they ate a piece of fruit. So we're supposed to take it literally, right? He ate a piece of fruit. So God punishes Adam and Eve because they ate a piece of fruit, of forbidden fruit, which the concept of forbidden, the concept of death, none of those things would make any sense to a one-day-old human being. And yet that's it. That's the story. That's why free will was, that's why God did this. And then the minds, these religious minds create all of this justification surrounding this one ridiculous story about how God really loves us and set us up for failure for all eternity, because we're never going to get back to the Garden of Eden. That ship sailed. You're God the Father, and let's say there was a God the Mother. She comes home. Gee, honey, where are the kids? No kids? What do you mean? You kicked them out of the house. What? Because they ate from Mr. Edwards' tree? Are you serious? Who would do that? Who would do that? No parent on earth would do that. Even the bad parents would probably know that's some kind of a crazy setup. It's not an act of love, that's for sure. And yet there you are. God created the scenario of good and evil just so Adam and Eve would choose goodness, even though they had no chance of choosing goodness, because they didn't even understand the circumstances of good and evil and what it meant to be dead. And if Eve surely understood what death was, that means you would no longer exist, that you would no longer be able to run through the garden, that you would die. But she didn't have that knowledge. So she gets to be the fall girl for everybody else's sin for all of eternity. Total setup. And who set it up? Your God, the Father. Insane. It's insane for you to believe these stories. They're not helpful for your spiritual development. They're not helpful for your contribution to peace on earth and to all the values that Christ wanted you to experience. But there it is. That's the story of wickedness. It only exists in the believer's mind to somehow convince yourself that the God that you believe in is a good God. He's not. He's absolutely wretched. I'm sorry to break it to you, but there you go. All right, well, I guess that's all I have to say about wickedness. You have a good life, you kids. Take care.